Welcome to History Teller YT, where forgotten histories are given voice and untold truths are finally heard. In today's journey, we dive into one of the most powerful and overlooked narratives in Philippine history, the long and continuing struggle of the indigenous peoples of Mindanao. From the sacred forests of the Subanen to the highland rituals of the Manobo, from ancestral land battles to cultural survival in a modernizing world, this is a story of identity, resistance, loss, and hope. You're about to witness a 500-year-long chronicle of neglect and resilience, betrayal and bravery, colonization and cultural endurance. Laws were passed, promises were made, but reality has often fallen short. And yet, the tribes of Mindanao remain, still standing, still singing, still fighting for their right to exist. This is not just their story. This is a reflection of what kind of nation we are and what kind of future we choose to build. Stay with us, because this is a history that needs to be heard, remembered, and honored. When people think of Philippine history, the stories that dominate are often centered on Luzon and the Visayas, the Spanish galleons in Manila, the revolution led by the CADTs, or the struggles of Ilustrados in cities like Cavite and Iloilo. Yet in the southern frontier of Mindanao, a different set of stories unfolded, narratives that are often forgotten or reduced to mere footnotes in school textbooks. Mindanao is home to dozens of indigenous groups: the Subanen, Manobo, Teduray, Higaonon, Mandaya, Bland, Bagobo, and many others, each with their own languages, traditions, and systems of governance. Long before colonial powers arrived, these tribes had already established ways of life rooted in kinship, in deep respect for the land, and in rituals that connected them to rivers, forests, and mountains. For them, land was not property to be bought or sold, but a sacred inheritance passed through generations. This worldview clashed profoundly with the concepts introduced later by colonizers, who measured land in hectares and deeds rather than through spiritual ties. The historical neglect of Mindanao's tribes was not merely accidental. It was systemic. Spanish chroniclers dismissed them as uncivilized, and American administrators later saw them as obstacles to the expansion of settler colonies. Even the post-independence Philippine government largely ignored their existence until conflicts over land and resources forced recognition. This silencing of indigenous narratives meant that for centuries, their voices remained unheard in national discourse, even though they were the first stewards of the archipelago's second largest island. Understanding the plight of indigenous peoples in Mindanao, therefore, requires us to look beyond the usual lens of national history and instead focus on their lived experiences, their cosmologies, and their centuries-long resistance to being erased. The island of Mindanao is not only geographically vast, but culturally diverse. It contains lush forests, expansive river systems, fertile plains, and rugged mountain ranges, each of which shaped the survival and development of the tribes that called it home. The Subanen, whose name means river people, settled along riverbanks in the Zamboanga Peninsula, sustaining themselves through fishing, swidden farming, and forest gathering. The Manobo, often regarded as one of the largest ethno-linguistic groups in Mindanao, spread across Higaonon, Bukidnon, and Cotabato, practicing shifting cultivation and crafting oral epics that rival any written literature. The Teduray, concentrated in Maguindanao, developed intricate systems of justice and governance based on consensus and respect for elders, while the Bland and Taboli in South Cotabato enriched Philippine culture with their weaving, beadwork, and dances that were not only art forms, but also acts of storytelling. Each of these tribes considered themselves nations in their own right, bound not by the idea of a centralized state, but by kinship networks, shared rituals, and territories that extended as far as memory could recall. The sacredness of land was central. Mountains were the dwelling places of spirits, rivers were lifelines of survival, and forests were not just sources of food, but sanctuaries of ancestral souls. Colonizers often mistook this reverence as primitiveness, but in reality, it represented a sophisticated ecological philosophy that ensured balance between people and nature. These indigenous cosmologies were not mere myths, but guiding principles that preserved biodiversity for centuries. Thus, when later governments and corporations sought to exploit Mindanao's resources, timber, minerals, fertile land, it was not simply an economic matter for the tribes. It was a direct assault on their identity, their spirituality, and their continuity as peoples. To truly understand their struggles today, we must first appreciate this deep-rooted connection between land, culture, and community. The marginalization of Mindanao's indigenous tribes did not begin only in modern times. From the earliest records of Spanish colonization, there were attempts to classify and divide the peoples of Mindanao into categories that served imperial interests. Those who resisted were branded as pagan or uncivilized, while those who converted were absorbed into colonial systems. Yet the remoteness of Mindanao's mountains and forests allowed many groups, especially the Subanen and Manobo, to retain their autonomy longer than lowland communities in Luzon and the Visayas. This relative independence, however, came at a cost. Because they remained outside colonial control, they were excluded from educational, economic, and political institutions that were slowly introduced in other parts of the country. By the time the Philippines gained independence in 1946, the indigenous peoples of Mindanao were already at a disadvantage, lacking representation in the national government and vulnerable to waves of settlers encouraged by state-sponsored resettlement programs. This structural neglect entrenched inequality across decades. Roads were built to connect settler towns, but not to reach tribal villages. Schools were erected in urban centers, while children in upland communities had to walk for hours just to access basic education, if any schools existed at all. Health services barely reached remote barangays, leaving indigenous populations to rely on herbal medicine and traditional healers. These disparities were not accidental. They reflected a government priority that consistently placed indigenous needs at the bottom. Worse still, as Mindanao became a site of migration, conflict, and resource extraction, indigenous tribes often found themselves displaced from their ancestral domains. Their marginalization was, therefore, not only about invisibility, but also about active dispossession. What began as neglect soon transformed into systemic exclusion and exploitation, a pattern that continues into the modern era and sets the stage for the struggles we will discuss in the next parts of this history. When Spanish colonizers arrived in the Philippines in the 16th century, their expansion was driven not only by conquest and religion, but also by economics. They sought gold, spices, and fertile lands that could be integrated into the galleon trade and into Spain's imperial economy. Yet Mindanao presented a peculiar challenge. Unlike the more centralized societies of Luzon and the Visayas, Mindanao was home to decentralized tribes and Islamic sultanates that were resistant to foreign authority. The Subanen, Teduray, and other upland tribes lived in relative isolation, while coastal areas like Maguindanao and Sulu had already established strong Muslim polities under the rule of Datus and sultans. The Spaniards encountered stiff resistance in trying to impose Christianity and colonial control, particularly because Islam was already deeply rooted in many coastal areas. This meant that Mindanao became both a religious and political frontier for Spain, a place where the battle for souls and sovereignty was especially difficult. For the indigenous tribes of the interior, the Spanish presence was often felt through military expeditions and religious missions. Missionaries tried to convert upland peoples, sometimes with initial success, but more often met with quiet resistance. To many tribes, conversion meant abandoning their ancestral rituals, sacred spaces, and traditional governance, so they resisted by retreating deeper into forests and mountains. While Spain managed to establish forts and garrisons in Zamboanga and Cotabato, its control over Mindanao remained tenuous, and vast areas stayed beyond colonial reach. However, the labeling of these groups as pagans and non-Christians placed them outside the framework of what Spain considered part of the civilized colony. This early classification laid the groundwork for centuries of exclusion, as indigenous peoples were consistently positioned as outsiders, unfit for equal recognition under colonial law. The Spanish agenda, therefore, was not just about conquest, but about creating a hierarchy in which indigenous groups occupied the lowest rungs. Despite the odds, Mindanao's indigenous communities did not passively accept colonial domination. Resistance took many forms: open battles, strategic retreats, and the preservation of culture in defiance of colonial assimilation. The Subanen people, for example, often withdrew deeper into the Zamboanga Peninsula when pressured by missionaries or soldiers, choosing isolation over submission. This retreat was itself a form of resistance, as it ensured the survival of their traditions and rituals. Similarly, the Manobo of Bukidnon and Higaonon engaged in sporadic uprisings, sometimes allying with neighboring groups to resist incursions into their lands. The Teduray, though smaller in number, protected their territories fiercely, relying on their kinship-based justice systems to maintain cohesion in the face of external threats. Resistance was not always armed. Many tribes resisted through cultural resilience, continuing to perform rituals, practicing indigenous governance, and transmitting oral traditions to younger generations. This cultural continuity was itself an act of defiance, because the colonial regime sought to erase or replace these systems with Christianity and Spanish law. The Spaniards often underestimated the determination of the tribes, believing that military expeditions could pacify them. Instead, these incursions deepened distrust and resentment. Records from the late 16th to the 18th century show repeated Spanish attempts to pacify Mindanao, but the results were limited. Forts were built, towns were garrisoned, but beyond these enclaves lay vast stretches of ancestral domain where indigenous authority remained intact. This long tradition of resistance would later serve as inspiration for modern struggles against state neglect and exploitation. It reinforced a collective memory among tribes that their survival depended on defending their lands, their governance, and their way of life, no matter the odds. Though Spain never fully subdued Mindanao, its long presence left lasting legacies that continue to shape the plight of indigenous peoples today. First, the colonial practice of categorizing populations into Christianized, Muslim, and non-Christian tribes institutionalized divisions that persisted even after independence. Indigenous groups who resisted conversion were branded as backward, and this stigma carried forward into policies of the American and Filipino governments in later centuries. Second, the introduction of private property and land titles by Spain disrupted indigenous concepts of land ownership. For tribes like the Subanen or Manobo, who considered land communal and sacred, the colonial system of deeds and taxation made no sense. Yet this system laid the foundation for later land grabbing, as indigenous territories were declared public lands by the colonial state if they were not formally titled. Finally, the militarization of Mindanao during the Spanish period set a precedent for viewing indigenous resistance as rebellion rather than as legitimate defense of ancestral rights. By labeling uprisings as insurrections, Spain criminalized indigenous self-defense, justifying punitive expeditions that devastated villages. These patterns of stigmatization, dispossession, and militarization were inherited by subsequent governments. Thus, while Spain never fully conquered Mindanao, it successfully entrenched frameworks of inequality that endured long after colonial rule. For the tribes of Mindanao, the Spanish period was not simply a story of resistance, but also of enduring marginalization, a period that began the long cycle of neglect and struggle for recognition. It marked the first chapter in a centuries-long history where indigenous peoples had to fight not only for survival, but also for the acknowledgement of their dignity and rights. When the United States took control of the Philippines after the Spanish-American War in 1898, Mindanao became one of the most challenging regions for American administrators. Unlike Luzon and the Visayas, where the revolutionaries had been partially subdued, Mindanao remained fiercely independent, home to Muslim sultanates and non-Muslim tribes who had resisted Spanish rule for centuries. The Americans, eager to consolidate their new colony, approached Mindanao with both military and bureaucratic strategies. They framed their mission as a civilizing project, echoing the rhetoric of benevolence and progress. But beneath this humanitarian facade lay a systematic effort to exploit Mindanao's vast resources, timber, fertile lands, and minerals, by integrating them into the colonial economy. For the indigenous tribes, this meant a new wave of incursions. American authorities did not merely attempt to govern from a distance. They sent soldiers, missionaries, and teachers into tribal areas, with the dual goal of pacification and assimilation. Education was introduced, often in English, with the intent of reshaping indigenous worldviews to align with American ideals of nationhood and citizenship. Roads, ports, and military garrisons were constructed not primarily for the benefit of indigenous peoples, but to facilitate the entry of settlers, soldiers, and investors. To the Subanen, Manobo, and Teduray, this new colonial regime appeared less brutal in some ways than Spain's military campaigns, but far more insidious in its legal and political implications. The Americans brought with them systems of land registration and private property that would devastate indigenous tenure systems. By redefining land as something that had to be titled and taxed, they rendered ancestral domains vacant public lands, ripe for redistribution to settlers and corporations. This was the beginning of a new kind of dispossession, one cloaked not in war but in paperwork. For many tribes, the laws and regulations of the American colonial state were incomprehensible, drafted in English and enforced through courts they had no access to. In effect, the Americans weaponized bureaucracy, turning the indigenous people's lack of familiarity with colonial law into a justification for taking away their lands. While the Americans called it progress, for the tribes of Mindanao, it marked the beginning of a dispossession more enduring than war, one inscribed in the very legal foundations of the modern Philippine state. The most devastating legacy of the American period in Mindanao was the introduction of land laws that erased indigenous ownership. The Public Land Act of 1903 declared all lands not registered under the Spanish regime as public lands. This immediately disenfranchised millions of hectares of ancestral domain because indigenous peoples had never engaged with the Spanish titling system. To the American legal mind, lands without formal titles were unoccupied, even if they had been lived on, farmed, and protected for centuries by indigenous groups. Later amendments reinforced this framework. The Land Registration Act and Homestead Program opened Mindanao's lands to migrants from Luzon and Visayas, promising them parcels of fertile soil if they relocated to the frontier. This policy fundamentally altered the demographic and cultural landscape of Mindanao. Waves of settlers, mostly Christian farmers displaced by land scarcity in Luzon and Visayas, migrated south, encouraged by government subsidies and the promise of opportunity. For indigenous peoples, however, this meant the steady shrinking of their ancestral domains. The Manobo of Higaonon lost vast tracts of fertile river valleys to homesteaders. The Subanen of Samboanga were pushed farther into uplands, as lowland plains were converted into plantations. The Teduray found their territories gradually encroached upon, often without consultation or consent. These changes were not isolated. By the 1930s, indigenous groups had already lost a significant portion of their lands, setting the stage for the conflicts that would erupt in later decades. What made this dispossession particularly cruel was the legalistic veneer that justified it. To American administrators, they were simply following rule of law. To indigenous communities, however, it was a direct violation of their identity, because land was never merely economic. It was spiritual, ancestral, and communal. The bureaucratic language of surveys, titles, and deeds erased centuries of tradition, and indigenous peoples were often labeled squatters on lands they had inhabited for generations. This legal erasure did not end with the Americans. It became embedded in Philippine land policies, persisting well into the post-independence period. Thus, what appeared to be a simple colonial policy of land distribution was, in fact, a structural act of displacement whose effects reverberate to this day. Alongside land laws, the Americans introduced public education in Mindanao, building schools in both settler and indigenous areas. They presented education as a gift, a way to uplift non-Christian tribes into the fold of a modern nation. But while education did provide new skills, it was also a tool of assimilation. Indigenous languages were discouraged, sometimes outright banned in classrooms, and replaced with English as the medium of instruction. Indigenous beliefs and rituals were described as superstitions, unfit for a progressive society. In this way, schools became spaces where the younger generation was subtly taught to distance itself from its ancestral roots. This policy of assimilation weakened cultural transmission, as children often returned home ashamed of their traditions, believing them inferior to Western ways. At the same time, education created an educated elite among indigenous groups. Some of these individuals would later become advocates for indigenous rights, using the very tools of literacy and law to resist further exploitation. By the 1930s, a small but growing number of educated Subanen, Manobo, and Teduray leaders began to question government policies, demanding recognition of ancestral rights and cultural practices. While they were often ignored by the colonial bureaucracy, their voices planted seeds for the modern indigenous rights movement. The contradictions of American rule, its promise of progress paired with dispossession, were not lost on the tribes. While some communities benefited from infrastructure, many saw these developments as facilitating their own marginalization. Roads were built not to connect tribal villages, but to bring settlers and extractive industries into ancestral lands. Education, while opening opportunities, also eroded traditional culture. The result was a double-edged colonial legacy, a foundation for modernization, but also the deepening of inequality and loss. More importantly, the American period cemented the idea that the state had supreme authority over land, a notion that would haunt indigenous people for the next century. When the Americans finally departed and independence was granted, the indigenous tribes of Mindanao found themselves not only dispossessed, but also structurally excluded from the new nation. Their struggle was no longer against a foreign power alone, but against a Filipino state that inherited colonial frameworks of control. When the Philippines gained independence in 1946, hopes were high that a new government, free from colonial masters, would finally bring justice to its marginalized peoples. Yet for the tribes of Mindanao, the post-war years only deepened their marginalization. One of the most consequential state policies was the promotion of government-sponsored resettlement programs. With the destruction of World War II and rising landlessness in Luzon and the Visayas, the government sought to open Mindanao as the nation's last frontier. In the 1950s and 1960s, agencies like the National Land Settlement Administration, NLSA, and later the National Resettlement and Rehabilitation Administration, NARA, actively facilitated the migration of thousands of families from the North and Central Philippines into Mindanao. For the settlers, this was framed as an opportunity for a fresh start, a chance to cultivate fertile lands and rebuild lives after war. For the government, it was both an economic and political strategy. Not only would the programs ease social tensions in Luzon, but they would also integrate Mindanao into the national economy. But for the indigenous peoples, these policies spelled disaster. Lands that had sustained Subanen, Manobo, Teduray, and Higaonon communities for centuries were suddenly declared public lands and allocated to migrants, many of whom had no understanding of the deep cultural ties between tribes and their ancestral domains. The indigenous peoples were rarely consulted in these processes. Instead, they were told that because they had no land titles, their ancestral territories were legally open for distribution. The result was a massive demographic transformation. By the 1970s, Christian settlers had become the majority in many parts of Mindanao, displacing indigenous peoples both physically and politically. Once autonomous communities found themselves surrounded by towns dominated by settlers, whose access to state resources gave them an overwhelming advantage. Indigenous groups were pushed farther into upland areas, forced to abandon fertile lowlands for rugged terrains where survival was more difficult. This pattern of resettlement not only dispossessed the tribes of their lands, but also fractured their societies as traditional governance structures struggled to adapt to the rapid pace of displacement. Far from correcting colonial injustices, the post-independence government intensified them, turning Mindanao into a site of systematic state-led dispossession. As settlers increased in number and indigenous land shrank, tensions inevitably rose. Disputes over land were common, often escalating into violence. Indigenous peoples, unarmed and unrecognized by the legal system, found themselves at a severe disadvantage. Courts, dominated by settler elites, often dismissed tribal claims, ruling in favor of those who held formal titles. When disputes could not be resolved legally, they frequently erupted into armed clashes. These conflicts were not merely about property. They were struggles for survival, as losing land meant losing access to food, water, and sacred spaces essential for cultural continuity. In some areas, settlers allied with local politicians and business elites to consolidate control. Mining concessions, logging permits, and large plantations were granted without consultation with indigenous groups, further alienating them from their ancestral domains. For example, logging companies in Bukidnon and Higaonon cleared vast tracts of forest, areas that had been hunting and gathering grounds for the Manobo. The destruction of forests not only robbed them of resources, but also desecrated spaces they considered sacred. Meanwhile, plantation economies introduced monocrops like pineapple and banana, replacing biodiverse landscapes with export-oriented agribusiness. The growing marginalization of indigenous groups also intersected with the rise of broader political conflicts in Mindanao. By the late 1960s and 1970s, the Muslim secessionist movement was gaining momentum, demanding autonomy for Moro communities who had also suffered dispossession. Indigenous peoples found themselves caught in the crossfire. Some aligned with Moro groups, sharing a common enemy in settler encroachment and state neglect, while others tried to remain neutral, focusing on defending their own ancestral domains. The militarization of Mindanao under Ferdinand Marcos's regime in the 1970s made matters worse. Counterinsurgency campaigns often targeted indigenous communities accused of supporting rebels, subjecting them to displacement, harassment, and violence. Thus, the post-war migration policies, instead of fostering national integration, became seeds of long-term conflict, leaving indigenous groups doubly marginalized, first by settlers and then by state militarization. Beyond the immediate loss of land and the violence of displacement, the post-war migration era brought with it a slower but equally devastating consequence: cultural erosion. As settlers established towns, schools, and churches, indigenous traditions were increasingly pushed to the margins. Children of Subanen, Manobo, and Teduray families were pressured to attend settler-run schools where instruction was in Filipino or English, languages foreign to their mother tongues. Their rituals and beliefs were often mocked as backward or pagan, forcing younger generations to internalize a sense of inferiority about their identity. Economic pressures also drove cultural erosion. With the loss of fertile lands, many indigenous families were forced to work as laborers in plantations owned by settlers or corporations. This shift from subsistence farming to wage labor undermined traditional communal practices of food sharing and collective farming. Migration also fractured kinship networks, as communities were scattered across uplands, unable to maintain the same level of ritual and cultural cohesion. Sacred sites, such as burial grounds and ritual spaces, were bulldozed for roads or converted into agricultural lands, erasing physical anchors of cultural memory. Yet despite these challenges, indigenous communities sought ways to resist cultural erasure. Ritual leaders, known as datis or timues, continued to conduct ceremonies, often in secret, to keep traditions alive. Elders emphasized oral transmission, ensuring that younger generations still heard epic chants, folk tales, and genealogies. In some cases, indigenous peoples forged alliances with sympathetic settlers, NGOs, or church groups who recognized the injustices of state policies. These alliances provided a measure of protection and advocacy, but they were not enough to stop the overwhelming tide of displacement. By the end of the 20th century, many indigenous groups in Mindanao had been reduced to minorities within their own homelands, a reversal of historical realities. Their plight was not the product of chance, but of deliberate government policies that prioritized national integration over indigenous survival. What emerged was a complex picture of resilience amid dispossession, a story that would continue into the later decades, setting the stage for the creation of legal instruments like the Indigenous Peoples Rights Act of 1997. By the late 1960s and 1970s, the cumulative effects of centuries of neglect and decades of systematic displacement had reached a breaking point for Mindanao's indigenous peoples. The loss of ancestral lands, coupled with the erosion of traditional governance and culture, created conditions that could no longer be endured quietly. Communities that had once relied on retreat into mountains and forests to escape colonization found that there were fewer and fewer safe spaces left. Logging concessions reached deep into the highlands. Mining companies blasted sacred mountains, and plantations fenced off fertile plains. For the Subanen and Samboanga, the Manobo and Bukidnon, and the Teduray and Maguineo, survival itself became a political struggle. It was in this climate of existential threat that indigenous leaders began to articulate their struggles not merely as local disputes, but as part of a broader rights movement. For the first time, terms like ancestral domain and indigenous rights began to gain traction in national conversations. Elders who had long resisted quietly began forging alliances with church leaders, student activists, and human rights advocates who were also challenging state abuses during the dictatorship of Ferdinand Marcos. These alliances amplified indigenous voices, framing their struggles as part of the larger call for democracy and justice. Indigenous leaders also began documenting their experiences, stories of displacement, broken promises, and desecrated sacred grounds, turning oral histories into written testimonies that could be shared in courts, conferences, and advocacy campaigns. This awakening was not without risks. Under martial law, any form of dissent was often branded as subversion, and many indigenous leaders were harassed, imprisoned, or even killed. Yet repression only strengthened their resolve. Out of dispossession emerged a realization. Survival required not only defending villages with bows and spears, but also asserting rights within legal and political frameworks. This was the birth of a new era in indigenous resistance, an era that recognized the necessity of combining traditional governance with modern advocacy. The seeds planted during this period would eventually blossom into the organized movements that pushed for landmark legislation in the 1990s. A crucial factor in the rise of indigenous rights movements was the support of church institutions and civil society organizations. During the 1970s and 1980s, various Catholic and Protestant groups, as well as secular NGOs, began to recognize the plight of indigenous peoples in Mindanao. Missionaries who lived among tribal communities witnessed firsthand the devastation wrought by logging and mining companies. In many cases, they became outspoken allies, documenting abuses and lobbying government officials to intervene. Church-based groups, such as the Episcopal Commission on Indigenous Peoples of the Catholic Church, played a significant role in reframing indigenous struggles as moral and spiritual issues, calling on society to respect the dignity of all peoples. Civil society groups also emerged as key players. Organizations like Task Force Indigenous Peoples' Rights, environmental advocacy groups, and later human rights NGOs provided training, legal support, and platforms for indigenous leaders to voice their concerns. Workshops were organized to teach indigenous representatives about legal processes, human rights frameworks, and negotiation tactics. For communities long excluded from formal political systems, these trainings were transformative. They empowered leaders not only to defend their ancestral domains, but also to articulate demands for social justice and cultural recognition. Perhaps most importantly, these alliances provided indigenous peoples with visibility. For centuries, they had been invisible to the national consciousness, dismissed as non-Christian tribes, relegated to the margins. But with the involvement of church leaders and NGOs, their struggles began to reach newspapers, university forums, and even international human rights organizations. Indigenous voices that had once been silenced were now part of national debates on democracy, development, and rights. This visibility, however, also made them targets. Many indigenous activists were harassed, threatened, or killed, particularly those who opposed powerful business interests. Yet despite the risks, the momentum could not be stopped. A movement had been born, one that was deeply rooted in the experiences of dispossession, yet increasingly sophisticated in its strategies of advocacy and resistance. As the indigenous rights movement matured, it began to expand from local struggles to national advocacy. By the mid-1980s, With the fall of the Marcos dictatorship and the restoration of democracy under Corazon Aquino, there was renewed hope for marginalized groups to assert their rights. Indigenous leaders seized this political opening, organizing congresses, dialogues, and conferences where they articulated their demands. They insisted that democracy could not be genuine if indigenous peoples remained excluded from decision-making processes. This period saw the emergence of indigenous federations and alliances that brought together diverse tribes across Mindanao, recognizing that their struggles, while unique in cultural context, were united by common themes of land dispossession, cultural erosion, and political neglect. One of the key concepts that gained traction during this time was ancestral domain. Unlike simple property rights, ancestral domain encompassed not only land but also rivers, forests, and sacred sites, spaces essential to the survival of indigenous identities. This holistic understanding of territory became the rallying cry of indigenous advocacy. Leaders like Datu Wilfredo L. Sangayan among the Subanen, and similar figures in Manobo and Teduray communities began speaking not only to local governments, but also to national policymakers, pushing for legal recognition of ancestral rights. Their efforts converged with broader social movements demanding constitutional reforms after the fall of Marcos. The ratification of the 1987 Philippine Constitution marked a milestone. For the first time, the Constitution explicitly recognized the rights of indigenous cultural communities to their ancestral lands. Though the provision was broad and lacked detailed implementation mechanisms, it represented a moral victory and a foundation upon which future laws could be built. Indigenous advocacy groups used this constitutional foothold to continue pushing for more concrete legislation, culminating a decade later in the passage of the Indigenous Peoples Rights Act, IPRA, of 1997. Thus, what began as scattered local resistances in remote villages had, by the 1990s, evolved into a coherent national movement that could influence the highest levels of policymaking. This transformation marked a turning point in the long struggle of Mindanao's tribes, a shift from invisibility to recognition, from silence to advocacy, and from passive endurance to active demand for justice. The passage of the Indigenous Peoples Rights Act, IPRA, in 1997 was not an accident of history. It was the culmination of decades of struggle, advocacy, and sacrifice. For centuries, the voices of indigenous peoples have been silenced, their lands taken, their cultures belittled. Yet by the 1990s, a convergence of local and global forces created the conditions for landmark legislation. Locally, indigenous movements had grown stronger, forged in the crucible of displacement and dispossession. From the Subanen of Samboanga to the Manobo of Bukidnon, indigenous leaders have become increasingly visible in national dialogues, often traveling long distances to Manila to bring their grievances to the halls of power. Their advocacy was amplified by allies in churches, NGOs, and human rights groups, many of whom had long campaigned for social justice during the Marcos dictatorship. Globally, there was also a shift. The 1990s saw the rise of international recognition of indigenous rights, with the United Nations pushing for frameworks that emphasized cultural preservation and self-determination. The momentum of global indigenous movements, from Latin America to Africa, gave Philippine advocates a broader stage, linking local struggles to worldwide calls for justice. It was within this context that legislators in the Philippines could no longer ignore the demands for formal recognition. After years of lobbying, dialogues, and consultations, Congress finally passed Republic Act 8371, more popularly known as the IPRA, in 1997. For indigenous peoples, IPRA represented more than a law. It was a moral victory, a long overdue acknowledgement of their identity and dignity as distinct peoples. For the first time in Philippine legal history, indigenous communities were recognized not merely as minorities needing assistance, but as nations within a nation with a right to ancestral domains, governance, culture, and social justice. It was a transformative shift in the legal imagination of the state, challenging the centuries-old assumption that indigenous peoples were relics of the past. With IPRA, the Philippines positioned itself as one of the first countries in Asia to adopt a comprehensive indigenous rights law, signaling to the world that it sought to correct historical wrongs. But as with all promises on paper, the true test lay in implementation. IPRA is structured around 4 key pillars of rights, each representing a dimension of indigenous survival and dignity. The first is the right to ancestral domain and lands. Unlike conventional land titles, ancestral domains recognize indigenous peoples' communal ownership over lands they have traditionally occupied, including rivers, forests, and natural resources. This provision was revolutionary because it acknowledged that land was not just an economic asset, but the lifeblood of indigenous identity. To operationalize this, IPRA created mechanisms for the issuance of certificates of ancestral domain title. See, legal documents meant to secure tribal ownership of territories that had often been treated as public lands. The second pillar is the right to self-governance and empowerment. This provision recognized traditional governance systems, such as the authority of Datis, Timues, Bay, and other indigenous leaders, while ensuring that indigenous communities could participate in mainstream political systems. A particularly notable innovation was the introduction of the Indigenous Peoples Mandatory Representative, IPMR, which guaranteed that every local government unit, from the barangay up to provincial boards, must include at least one representative of indigenous communities. This was designed to ensure that indigenous voices were no longer absent from decision-making processes. The third pillar is the right to social justice and human rights. This provision committed the state to protecting indigenous peoples from discrimination and to ensuring their equal access to healthcare, education, and livelihood opportunities. Recognizing that indigenous communities had long been last in line for government services, this pillar aimed to correct structural inequalities. Finally, the fourth pillar is the right to cultural integrity. This guaranteed the preservation of indigenous languages, rituals, practices, and sacred sites. It recognized that cultural survival was as important as political or economic survival, and that the destruction of sacred rivers, forests, or burial grounds was a violation of indigenous rights. Taken together, these four pillars represented a holistic vision of justice, one that saw indigenous peoples not as objects of charity, but as partners in nation building. On paper, IPRA seemed like a landmark shift, a blueprint for reconciliation between the state and its indigenous citizens. To implement IPRA, the government created the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples, NCIP, an agency tasked with enforcing the law and facilitating the recognition of ancestral domains. The NCP was given a crucial mandate to oversee the processing of CADTs, mediate conflicts, and ensure that indigenous peoples were represented in political structures. It was also tasked with monitoring compliance with free, prior, and informed consent, FPIC, a process that required any government or private project affecting ancestral domains to obtain the genuine consent of the affected indigenous communities. In theory, this gave tribes powerful leverage against mining companies, logging firms, and other industries that had historically encroached on their territories. The establishment of the IPMR system was another historic innovation. For centuries, indigenous peoples have been excluded from formal politics, their governance structures dismissed as customary, and thus outside the purview of modern democracy. By mandating the inclusion of IPMRs, the law sought to institutionalize indigenous participation in governance. In practice, this meant that a Subanen leader in Samboanga del Sur or a Teduray elder in Maguindanao could now sit in municipal councils, provincial boards, or even in Congress through sectoral representation. It was a recognition that democracy could not be complete without the voices of the first peoples of the land. At the time of its passage, IPRA was hailed both locally and internationally as a landmark in indigenous rights legislation. Advocates celebrated it as the culmination of decades of struggle, while policymakers held it up as evidence of the Philippines' commitment to social justice. Yet even as hope surged, skeptics warned that the gap between law and practice in the Philippines was often wide. Passing a progressive law was one thing. Enforcing it amid entrenched political interests, bureaucratic inefficiency, and corporate power was another. For the tribes of Mindanao, IPRA was both a victory and a challenge. It gave them a powerful legal tool, but it also required vigilance, unity, and persistence to transform written promises into lived realities. As the years that followed would reveal, the law's potential was enormous, but its implementation would be fraught with obstacles that kept indigenous peoples struggling for recognition. While the Indigenous Peoples Rights Act, IPRA, of 1997 promised indigenous peoples full recognition of their ancestral lands, the reality on the ground unfolded very differently. More than 2 decades after the law's passage, only a fraction of the ancestral domains claimed by tribes across the Philippines have received formal recognition in the form of certificates of ancestral domain title CADTs. For many communities, particularly in Mindanao, this legal recognition has remained an elusive dream. The process, though well-intentioned, is plagued by bureaucracy, underfunding, and political resistance. To obtain a CDT, a tribe must first submit historical, anthropological, and geographical proof of occupation. This is followed by boundary delineation, community validation, public notification, and approval by the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples, NCIP. While the process is designed to be participatory and thorough, in practice it is long, expensive, and often mired in delays. Many tribal communities, like the Subanen in the Samboanga Peninsula, have waited more than a decade for their CADT applications to be processed. In some cases, the delay has reached 15 to 20 years, an entire generation left in limbo. One major bottleneck is the lack of funding for the required technical components, such as land surveys and ancestral domain mapping. The NCIP, though tasked with implementing IPRA, often lacks the resources and personnel needed to fast-track these applications. Anthropologists, survey teams, and legal experts are few, and when they are available, they may be overwhelmed by hundreds of pending claims. Moreover, the communities themselves are often required to shoulder some of the costs for meetings, transportation, and documentation, a difficult burden for people who are already among the most economically marginalized in the country. While the law is clear that ancestral domains should be recognized based on customary law and long-term occupation, the demand for documentary proof makes it almost inaccessible for communities whose traditions are rooted in oral history, not written records. As a result, many tribes are caught in a cruel irony. They have the right to their land under the law, but the process to claim it is too complicated and too expensive to navigate. What was meant to be a landmark law of justice has, in too many cases, become a frustrating maze of red tape. Even when indigenous communities succeed in navigating the complicated requirements for ancestral domain claims, they often face opposition from powerful political and economic actors. Local government units, business corporations, And even national agencies sometimes resist the titling of ancestral lands, especially when those lands overlap with areas of economic interest. This includes logging concessions, mining permits, tourism zones, and agricultural plantations. These conflicting interests frequently delay, derail, or altogether stop the recognition process, despite IPRA's clear provisions. For example, in parts of Zamboanga del Norte, Subanen communities have applied for CADTs only to find their applications blocked by local politicians who have business stakes in logging operations. In Bukidnon, Manobo ancestral claims have been challenged by plantation owners who have cultivated the land for decades and now view the indigenous presence as a threat to their profits. In such cases, ancestral domain claims are not only delayed, they become battlegrounds for survival. Political dynasties and corporate entities often file legal cases or claim ownership through outdated land titles or fake documents, creating confusion and legal entanglements that the indigenous applicants are ill-equipped to resolve. Another layer of complexity is state infrastructure projects. Roads, dams, and energy installations are often declared as projects of national interest, which can override even existing CADTs or ancestral claims under Philippine law. In these situations, the required free, prior, and informed consent, FPIC, is often bypassed or manipulated. Instead of genuinely consulting the community, project proponents may pressure a few leaders to sign consent forms without community awareness or understanding. Some are even bribed or threatened into agreeing. In extreme cases, indigenous leaders who oppose these projects have been red tagged, harassed, or even assassinated. This use of fear and coercion undermines the very spirit of IPRA, which was supposed to protect communities from exploitation. The power imbalance between tribes and corporations remains stark. Even with legal protections on their side, indigenous peoples often find themselves defenseless in the face of well-funded companies, corrupt politicians, and a justice system that favors those with influence and money. The consequences of delayed or denied ancestral domain recognition are not merely administrative. They are existential. Without legal recognition of their lands, indigenous communities are left in a vulnerable state where their territories can be taken, leased, or destroyed without consequence. This insecurity trickles down into every aspect of their lives. It disrupts food systems, breaks cultural continuity, and fosters a deep sense of uncertainty about the future. For instance, when logging operations begin in untitled ancestral forests, families lose access to their traditional hunting and gathering grounds. When mining activities begin without consent, rivers become polluted, sacred sites are desecrated, and health risks increase. Without land, there can be no sustainable livelihood, and without livelihood, communities are forced to migrate, often to cities where they become informal settlers, again without land, without rights, and without cultural roots. Moreover, the lack of recognition weakens indigenous governance systems. Under IPRA, communities are supposed to govern their ancestral domains using their customary laws and traditional leadership structures. But in areas where no CADT exists, these structures are often ignored by local governments. Tribal decisions carry no legal weight, and local officials may refuse to acknowledge the authority of traditional leaders like Datis or Timues. This not only erodes indigenous sovereignty, but also creates internal divisions within communities. Elders who were once respected lose influence, and younger generations may become disillusioned with their culture, seeing it as powerless in the modern world. Education and development are also affected. Many government programs, including agricultural assistance, road building, and school construction, require formal land titles before being implemented. This means that untitled ancestral domains are often excluded from basic services. As a result, many indigenous villages remain without roads, schools, electricity, or health centers, not because they are far-flung, but because they lack the paperwork that the state demands. This is the cruel paradox of the law. IPRA promises equal access and protection, but in practice, the lack of recognition prevents the delivery of those very benefits. The outcome is a cycle of exclusion that perpetuates poverty, disenfranchisement, and cultural erosion. For many tribes, the ancestral domain is not just about land. It is about life, identity, and continuity. Until these rights are fully recognized, the dream of justice remains just that, a dream unfulfilled. Mindanao is rich in natural resources, vast mineral deposits, hardwood forests, fertile lands, and freshwater sources. For indigenous communities, these resources are sacred and are deeply embedded in their cosmologies, used sustainably for generations. But for the Philippine state and corporations, these riches represent economic opportunity and national development. The push to extract and exploit Mindanao's natural resources has turned the ancestral lands of indigenous peoples into prime targets for mining, logging, and agribusiness. And despite the protections offered by the Indigenous Peoples Rights Act, IPRA, the presence of extractive industries continues to be one of the most dangerous threats to tribal survival. Logging concessions, both legal and illegal, were among the first to invade indigenous territories. Under previous administrations, large tracts of virgin forests in areas like Bukidnon, Agusan del Sur, and the Zamboanga Peninsula were awarded to companies, sometimes under sustainable forestry programs that masked widespread deforestation. These forests, however, were not empty lands. They were ancestral homes, hunting grounds, and spiritual sites for the Manobo, Higaonon, Subanen, and other tribes. Logging operations destroyed biodiversity, caused erosion, and polluted water sources. Often, companies failed to secure genuine free, prior, and informed consent, FPIC, instead negotiating only with selected leaders or fabricating consent documents altogether. Mining followed, especially in the 1990s and 2000s, when the Philippine government liberalized the mining sector under the Mining Act of 1995. Large-scale operations by multinational corporations were allowed to explore and operate in mineral-rich regions, many of which overlapped with ancestral domains. In South Cotabato, Surigao, Compostela Valley, and Zamboanga del Norte, indigenous land were carved out for gold, copper, and nickel extraction. Open-pit mining destroyed mountains, poisoned rivers with mercury and cyanide, and dislocated entire communities. The environmental damage was immense, but so was the spiritual loss. For tribes whose rituals depended on clean rivers, sacred forests, and undisturbed landscapes, mining was not only ecological devastation, it was cultural annihilation. Despite legal safeguards, these operations often proceeded with impunity, bolstered by local political elites and military protection. One of the key provisions of IPRA is the requirement of free, prior, and informed consent, FPIC, before any development project is initiated on ancestral lands. In principle, FPIC gives indigenous communities the power to say no to any project that threatens their territory or way of life. But in reality, FPIC has often been reduced to a box-ticking exercise manipulated by powerful interests. Companies and government agencies regularly find ways to bypass or fake the process, turning what should be a protective measure into a dangerous loophole. In many communities, FPIC consultations are done without full and transparent participation. Notices are sent in Filipino or English rather than local dialects, and meetings are held far from tribal centers, excluding elders and women who play key roles in decision-making. In some cases, companies offer token gifts, cash, rice, or construction materials in exchange for signatures. These are presented as development aid, but are, in reality, subtle forms of bribery. There have also been instances where only a few hand-picked leaders, often those with close ties to political clans or outsiders, are asked to sign consent forms. These so-called leaders do not represent the will of the community, but their signatures are used to validate massive extractive projects. Worse still, resistance to these projects is often met with intimidation, militarization, or violence. Indigenous leaders who oppose mining or logging have been harassed, red-tagged, or even killed. In regions like Caraga and northern Mindanao, human rights groups have documented cases where military or paramilitary forces were deployed to secure mining zones, leading to confrontations with indigenous residents. Communities are pressured to accept development projects under the threat of being labeled as supporters of insurgents. This climate of fear undermines the entire spirit of FPIC, turning consent into coercion. The term informed loses meaning when misinformation is spread. Prior becomes moot when bulldozers arrive before consultations finish. And free becomes a lie when guns are present at the negotiation table. In the end, FPIC is often not a shield for indigenous rights, but a weapon turned against them, used to legitimize the very projects they oppose. Another major force displacing indigenous peoples of Mindanao is the aggressive expansion of agribusiness plantations. Global demand for bananas, pineapples, and palm oil has turned large parts of the island into monocropped agricultural zones operated by transnational companies. These plantations often receive generous tax incentives and land leases from the government, making them profitable enterprises for investors, but devastating realities for indigenous communities. The fertile lowlands and valley regions, once used for communal farming, gathering, and ritual activities, are converted into chemical-heavy plantations surrounded by barbed wire fences. For instance, in South Cotabato and parts of Bukidnon, indigenous groups like the Bland and Manobo have seen their lands turned into vast banana and pineapple plantations. These operations are usually covered by long-term lease agreements with the state or local elites, often ignoring or invalidating indigenous land claims. The arrival of plantations brings not just environmental change, but also social dislocation. Community members are often pushed to work as laborers on land they once owned. They earn meager wages, are exposed to pesticides, and have no control over the production process. Traditional food systems are disrupted as forests and communal gardens are replaced with export-oriented crops. Additionally, plantation expansion contributes to the fragmentation of ancestral domains. Roads are built to transport goods, settlements are relocated, and sacred sites are flattened in the name of progress. Water sources are redirected for irrigation, leading to shortages in nearby communities. The constant application of agrochemicals contaminates soil and rivers, with long-term effects on public health. Despite these impacts, plantation projects are often presented as development and are supported by local governments eager for revenue. Resistance is difficult because these operations are backed by permits, legal contracts, and even military escorts. The cumulative effect of mining, logging, and plantations is that indigenous communities are hemmed in from all sides. Even those who manage to secure CADTs find their domains sliced into enclaves by legal development projects. What remains is often not enough to sustain cultural practices, agricultural systems, or ecological balance. Indigenous peoples are thus left with a tragic paradox. They are recognized as stewards of the land, yet systematically denied the space, resources, and protection to fulfill that role. In theory, the law defends them. In practice, it is the corporations who win. One of the boldest and most transformative aspects of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, IPRA, of 1997 was the creation of the Indigenous Peoples Mandatory Representative, IPMR, system. This innovation recognized that for too long, Indigenous peoples have been politically invisible, excluded from councils, sidelined in policy decisions, and underrepresented in structures of governance. The IPMR provision sought to correct this by mandating that every local government unit, LGU, from boundaries to provinces, must include an appointed Indigenous representative. These representatives, chosen through traditional processes recognized by their communities, would have the same rights and powers as any other elected official. The right to speak, to vote, to propose legislation, and to protect the interests of their tribe in political forums. The idea was revolutionary. It meant that a Subanen Timue in Samboanga, a Teduray leader in Mindanao, or a Higaonon elder in Bukidnon could sit side by side with governors, mayors, and councilors, bringing ancestral wisdom into modern governance. In theory, it was a chance to ensure that Indigenous concerns would no longer be treated as afterthoughts. IPMRs could advocate for ancestral domain recognition, ensure FPIC processes were respected, push for the inclusion of Indigenous children in education plans, and resist extractive projects that threaten their communities. Importantly, the IPMR system also represented a philosophical shift in governance. It acknowledged that democracy could not be built only on votes and numbers. It must also account for historical exclusion, cultural diversity, and customary leadership. In this way, the IPMR system was not a form of tokenism. It was an assertion of self-determination and an institutional bridge between traditional governance and the modern state. It was designed not just to place an Indigenous person at the table, but to ensure that Indigenous voices would shape the agenda. However, as noble as the design was, the implementation of the IPMR system has been riddled with challenges, resistance, and systemic dysfunction. Despite being enshrined in national law, the implementation of the IPMR system has been inconsistent, uneven, and often resisted at the local level. Many local government units, LGUs, either due to ignorance or intentional defiance, have delayed or outright refused to seat IPMRs. Some have questioned the selection process. Others have disputed the authority of the NCFP, and a few have gone as far as claiming that adding another representative to their councils would disrupt political balance. In practice, this often reflects deeper political resistance to Indigenous empowerment, especially in areas where ancestral domain claims or tribal opposition might conflict with business or political interests. In several municipalities across Samboanga del Sur and Samboanga Sibigay, for example, Subanen IPMRs faced long delays in appointment due to disputes among local officials, conflicting claims from different tribal factions, or simply lack of political will. Some LGUs refused to allocate funds for the operations of the IPMR, arguing that they were not elected officials and therefore not entitled to the same support. Others cited technicalities in the IPMR guidelines or imposed additional requirements not found in the IPRA law, effectively stalling the process indefinitely. Even when IPMRs are successfully installed, many face systemic limitations. They may be denied staff support, office space, or budget allocations. They are sometimes excluded from key committee meetings or not informed of sessions where crucial votes take place. There are also cases where IPMRs are expected to go along with the decisions of dominant political blocs, rather than act independently on behalf of their communities. In worst-case scenarios, IPMRs are manipulated, co-opted, or even harassed into silence. These patterns reveal a contradiction at the heart of Philippine democracy. The law mandates inclusion, but power structures resist it. The IPMR system promises representation, but in many places, indigenous leaders are treated as ceremonial or secondary. The very people who were supposed to give voice to the voiceless are themselves muted by the structures they were meant to challenge. This undermines not just the spirit of IPRA, but the legitimacy of democratic governance itself. While external resistance poses a serious barrier to the effectiveness of IPMRs, challenges also arise within indigenous communities themselves. The IPMR system requires that representatives be selected in accordance with customary laws and practices, but in many tribes, such processes were never standardized or formalized. This can lead to conflicting claims of legitimacy, especially in large or diverse tribal groups. For instance, in some areas, multiple lineages or clans may each claim the right to nominate the IPMR, leading to disputes that delay appointments for years. In other cases, traditional leaders may be accused of favoritism or manipulation, causing rifts within the community. In some instances, the disputes are fueled by political actors who exploit tribal divisions for their own ends. Local politicians may secretly support one IPMR candidate over another, in hopes of installing a friendly representative who won't oppose extractive projects or land conversions. This not only weakens tribal unity, but undermines the credibility of the IPMR institution as a whole. When a selection process becomes politicized, the IPMR is no longer seen as the genuine voice of the community, but as an extension of external interests. Moreover, many IPMRs, especially those who come from remote areas, are not adequately prepared for the complexities of modern governance. While they may be deeply respected in their communities, they are often thrust into a political system that operates in legalese, bureaucracy, and negotiation tactics they've never encountered before. Without sufficient capacity-building programs, training, and institutional support, IPMRs struggle to navigate the intricate landscape of municipal budgets, legislative procedures, and multi-sectoral planning. This leaves them vulnerable to manipulation, or worse, ineffective and isolated. Yet despite these difficulties, there are examples of success. In some municipalities, IPMRs have introduced ordinances to protect sacred sites, improved health access, and halted illegal logging operations. These achievements show that with the right support, the system can work. What's needed is a concerted effort to strengthen the institution by training IPMRs, standardizing selection guidelines, ensuring LGU compliance, and insulating the role from political interference. Only then can the IPMR truly serve its intended purpose, to be the voice of the indigenous peoples in the halls of power, and not just a symbolic seat at the table. Even with the passage of the Indigenous Peoples Rights Act, IPRA, the grim reality remains that indigenous communities are often the last to receive basic government services. In Mindanao, this systemic neglect is painfully visible. Tribal barangays, usually located in upland, remote, or forested areas, are rarely prioritized in local development planning. Roads stop before reaching their communities. Health centers are kilometers away. Schools are either non-existent or under-resourced. Electricity, clean water, and even cellular signal, standard amenities in urban centers, are often considered luxuries for these marginalized communities. This disparity is not merely due to geography, it is structural. Government budgets at the provincial and municipal levels are commonly funneled toward projects that benefit the voting majority. Since indigenous peoples often constitute small minorities in their own provinces, especially in areas heavily settled by migrants from Luzon and Visayas. They are frequently excluded from decision-making and planning. The logic of majority benefit leaves them invisible in development schemes. For example, a Subanen community living in the mountains of Zamboanga del Norte may have to walk 3 hours to the nearest clinic. Pregnant women, elderly residents, and children with fevers or infections face risks simply because basic health services do not reach them. Compounding the problem is the lack of culturally sensitive service delivery. When health workers do visit tribal areas, they often bring mainstream approaches that ignore indigenous practices, beliefs, or languages. Medical instructions are given in Cebuano or Filipino, languages that some elders do not speak fluently. Health campaigns may ignore local herbal knowledge or spiritual beliefs, leading to mistrust. This cultural disconnect results in poor health outcomes, as communities either avoid services or use them improperly due to misunderstanding. The state often justifies the absence of services by citing cost or distance, but this reasoning fails to acknowledge the government's responsibility to equitably serve all citizens, especially those historically excluded. What the data continues to show is that IP communities lag behind in nearly every human development indicator. Malnutrition, maternal deaths, infant mortality, and communicable diseases remain high. Until there is a serious investment in infrastructure and a shift in planning priorities, indigenous communities will continue to be treated not as equal citizens, but as footnotes in national development. Education is a powerful tool, not just for personal upliftment, but for cultural survival. Yet for many indigenous children in Mindanao, access to education is a daily struggle. The first barrier is physical access. In mountain communities, students often trek for hours, crossing rivers, hiking steep trails, and enduring harsh weather, just to reach the nearest school. For younger children, this journey is not only difficult, but dangerous. The result is high dropout rates and poor attendance, especially in areas with no public transportation or accessible road systems. The second and perhaps more damaging barrier is cultural alienation. The mainstream Philippine education system is rooted in a Western, lowland Christian framework designed for urban or settler populations. This system does not account for indigenous ways of knowing, local languages, or traditional knowledge systems. Textbooks rarely mention the histories of the Teduray, Subanen, Manobo, or Higaonon. Cultural beliefs are ignored or even ridiculed. Indigenous festivals, epics, and rituals are treated as folklore, not as legitimate forms of heritage. As a result, many IP students feel that school is not a space that welcomes or respects their identity. They are taught that to be educated means to speak a foreign language, abandon their dialect, and leave behind their customs. Language is a particular battleground. Although the mother tongue-based multilingual education, MTBMLE, policy was introduced in 2012 under the Department of Education, its implementation in IP areas has been patchy. There are few trained teachers fluent in indigenous languages, and even fewer instructional materials written in those dialects. In some tribal schools, lessons are still conducted entirely in Filipino or English, leaving students confused, disengaged, and frustrated. Those who do manage to stay in school often struggle with standardized tests and national assessments, which reflect cultural contexts alien to their experience. In recent years, the Department of Education launched the Indigenous Peoples Education (IPED) program, aiming to make education more culturally relevant. Some success stories have emerged: community-run schools, use of local epics in classrooms, and incorporation of indigenous arts. But funding remains limited, teacher training is inadequate, and political support is inconsistent. The transformation of education for IP communities requires more than policy. It requires political will, sustained resources, and community-led participation. Otherwise, schools will continue to be spaces of erasure rather than empowerment. The failures in delivering appropriate education and services to Indigenous youth have far-reaching consequences, not just for economic development, but for cultural survival. In many IP communities across Mindanao, there is growing concern about the disconnect between elders and the younger generation. As youth are drawn to urban centers for work or immersed in mainstream education systems that ignore their heritage, they begin to lose the language, values, and rituals of their ancestors. Many cannot perform basic cultural practices, such as traditional dances, weaving, or oral storytelling. Some cannot even speak their tribal language fluently, having grown up in towns where Cebuano or Tagalog dominate. This generational disconnection is a direct result of state neglect and assimilationist policies. Because traditional practices are not reinforced in formal education or community programming, young people are taught, subtly or explicitly, that their culture is irrelevant in modern society. Mass media also plays a role, presenting Indigenous life as backward or romanticized rather than vibrant and contemporary. The result is internalized shame. Some IP youth express discomfort wearing traditional clothing or joining rituals for fear of ridicule from peers. Others aspire to completely abandon their identity, believing that survival in today's world requires full integration into mainstream norms. At the same time, the older generation struggles to pass on cultural knowledge. Ritual leaders, oral historians, and artisans lament that there are fewer apprentices willing to learn. Ceremonies that once involved entire communities now struggle to gather participants. Sacred chants go unsung. Traditional governance systems are weakening, not just because of external pressure, but because fewer young people recognize their value. This erosion is not accidental. It is the slow and silent cost of decades of cultural marginalization. Yet amidst these challenges, there are signs of resistance. In some areas, Indigenous youth groups are reviving rituals, organizing language classes, and using social media to share tribal stories. They are proving that modernity and tradition need not be at odds. But these efforts cannot flourish in isolation. They need institutional support, both from the government and from within their own communities. If the current gaps in education and service delivery remain, we risk losing not just languages or customs, but entire worldviews, ways of relating to land, time, and community that have sustained people for generations. To neglect IP education is not just to fail a child, it is to erase a civilization. For the Indigenous peoples of Mindanao, the land is not just a source of livelihood, it is a sacred archive. Every mountain, river, tree, and stone holds a memory. These are not simply natural resources or scenic spots as defined by developers or tourism boards. They are sites of spiritual power, ancestral presence, and communal identity. However, these sacred spaces are increasingly under threat from extractive industries, infrastructure projects, religious impositions, and cultural neglect. Despite the recognition of cultural integrity under the Indigenous Peoples Rights Act, IPRA, the ground reality tells a different story. Indigenous burial grounds have been bulldozed for highways. Ritual spaces have been flooded by dams. Forest groves, considered dwelling places of spirits, have been razed to make way for plantations or military camps. Take, for example, the Subanen people whose rituals are deeply tied to river systems and mountain forests across the Zamboanga Peninsula. For generations, they have performed bucklog ceremonies in forest clearings, honoring spirits and ancestors to maintain balance between humans and the natural world. But today, many of these ritual spaces are either degraded or inaccessible. Logging has stripped the trees, mining has polluted the rivers, and infrastructure has cut through pathways once used for spiritual pilgrimages. Worse, there are reports of sacred stones being used as construction materials, not out of malice, but from ignorance and disregard. The spiritual consequences are devastating, not just because traditions are broken, but because communities feel a loss of protection, harmony, and connection. The law provides that sacred sites should be protected, but often no maps exist and no official registry of these places is maintained. Developers cannot protect what they do not recognize, and many LGUs fail to consult with indigenous elders before approving projects. Furthermore, when sacred sites are desecrated, there are rarely legal consequences. The burden of proof falls on the communities, who must explain their cosmology in a courtroom designed for property disputes, not spiritual claims. In this way, the legal system becomes another instrument of erasure. Protecting cultural integrity must go beyond rhetoric. It must involve respecting space. Not only physical space, but the invisible spiritual geography that defines the world of indigenous peoples. Cultural integrity is not only about land. It is also about language, ritual, and oral memory. For indigenous communities, knowledge is passed not through written texts, but through epics, chants, dances, and stories that live in a voice and body. These oral traditions carry cosmologies, laws, genealogies, and moral lessons. Yet many of these traditions are endangered, not by active persecution, but by neglect and silence. With fewer venues to perform them, fewer apprentices to learn them, and fewer elders to teach them, these intangible treasures are fading. Languages are particularly vulnerable. Across Mindanao, dozens of indigenous languages, Subanen, Teduray, Bland, Higaonon, Manobo, Teboli, are losing speakers. Younger generations, often educated in Cebuano, Tagalog, or English, grow up without fluency in their mother tongues. This is not just a linguistic loss, it is a rupture in worldview. Indigenous languages carry unique ways of expressing time, space, community, and spirituality. When a language dies, so too does a distinct way of seeing and being in the world. While the Philippine Constitution recognizes the value of indigenous languages, actual support for their preservation is minimal. There are few language revitalization programs, few tribal dictionaries, and even fewer incentives for schools to incorporate mother tongue instruction beyond the primary years. Rituals face a similar crisis. Ceremonies that once involved the whole community are now attended by a few elders. Music that once echoed through mountain valleys is now replaced by television and smartphones. Young people, shaped by urban media and disconnected from the land, sometimes feel embarrassed to join tribal dances or recite ancient chants. This is not simply their fault. It is the result of a society that devalues indigenous identity. Without institutional support or platforms for cultural expression, traditions become private and eventually forgotten. And yet, these traditions are not just cultural flourishes. They are systems of resilience. Many rituals are ecological calendars, marking planting seasons, harvests, and animal migrations. Oral stories teach justice, compassion, and community ethics. Losing them means losing centuries of environmental wisdom and social cohesion. Safeguarding cultural integrity requires active transmission. Festivals, cultural schools, intergenerational dialogue. Without this, the spirit of a people disappears long before the last elder passes. While some aspects of indigenous culture are ignored or neglected, Others face a different threat: commodification. Across the Philippines, there's growing interest in indigenous arts, clothing, dances, and rituals, often packaged for tourism, fashion, or commercial events. On the surface, this visibility might seem like a good thing, but too often, this attention comes without respect, consent, or context. Indigenous culture becomes a product, stripped of meaning and repurposed for profit. Traditional clothing patterns, woven by hand and imbued with tribal symbols, are copied and sold by non-IP businesses with no attribution or compensation. Ritual dances are performed in festivals for tourists, without the sacred context they require. Some schools even have students play dress up as tribal people during cultural months, reducing centuries of heritage to costumes and props. These practices may appear benign, but they perpetuate stereotypes, rob communities of ownership over their identity, and disrespect the sacredness of their traditions. More dangerously, some local governments promote indigenous culture in ways that serve their political or economic agenda. They fund cultural festivals or tribal shows, yet deny funding for actual tribal schools or ritual grounds. They invite dadists to ceremonies for photo ops, but refuse to seat their IPMRs in decision-making bodies. This performative inclusion hides the reality of continued exclusion. Culture is showcased when convenient, but not protected when under threat. Meanwhile, mainstream media often portrays indigenous peoples in two extremes, as either noble savages from mythical past or as primitive obstacles to development. Rarely are they shown as contemporary citizens navigating complex realities, holding both tradition and modernity in their hands. This misrepresentation has real impacts. It shapes public perception, influences policy decisions, and contributes to social discrimination. Protecting cultural integrity means saying no to appropriation and yes to community-led expression. It means supporting tribal weavers, not mass-producing their patterns. It means funding schools that teach in mother tongue, not just hosting parades. It means creating platforms for IP youth to tell their own stories in their own voice. Culture is not a relic to be displayed. It is a living, breathing legacy, one that needs protection, respect, and rightful ownership. And for that, the role of the state, civil society, and the broader public is crucial. Across the tribal landscapes of Mindanao, traditional leaders like the Timue, Datu, Bay, and Balin serve as custodians of culture, law, and memory. They are not merely figures of symbolic importance. They are guardians of peace, custodians of land, mediators of conflict, and spiritual anchors in their communities. In societies without written constitutions or centralized governments, their words carry authority drawn from consensus, kinship, and ancestral mandate. And yet, despite their foundational role, these leaders have been repeatedly sidelined by modern institutions. Their voices, filled with wisdom and lived experience, are often drowned out by bureaucrats, politicians, and corporate executives who neither understand nor respect tribal systems. Take, for instance, Timue Malenio Ulama, a Teduray leader and advocate who played a key role in peace-building efforts and indigenous rights movements in the ARMM, autonomous region in Muslim Mindanao. For years, he reminded government bodies that indigenous peoples do not merely seek participation. They seek recognition as equal nation peoples with their own systems. His message was clear: you cannot bring peace to Mindanao while continuing to exclude its first inhabitants. Similarly, Datu Danda, a Subanen elder, has long emphasized the importance of honoring traditional decision-making. In his words, "We have our own laws, our own ways of settling disputes. If the government wants peace, it must walk with us, not just over us. These leaders have warned time and again that many government programs, even those meant for indigenous welfare, bypass customary law. Projects are implemented without consultation, funds are released without community validation, and policies are written in languages that few tribal members understand. The result is conflict, not just between tribes and the state, but within communities as traditional authority is eroded. For these elders, development without dignity is a form of violence. They ask not to be romanticized or pitted, but to be respected. And they urge the state to remember that ancestral domains are not vacant land. They are governed territories with law, memory, and sacred purpose embedded in every hill and river. If we listen closely to the grassroots, we hear not just statistics or policy gaps, but deeply human stories of resilience, betrayal, and hope. These voices often come from elders who have lived through decades of transition, from colonial control to independence, from dictatorship to democracy, from forest abundance to environmental degradation. They have seen their lands fenced off, their rivers poisoned, their rituals mocked, and yet they continue to speak, to teach, to resist. Consider the case of Bay Emma Maleo, a Manobo woman leader from Bukidnon. For years, she traveled by foot and bus to attend dialogues and conferences, bringing with her testimonies of land grabbing, cultural erosion, and displacement. In one forum, she shared how a plantation company cleared a sacred grove where her community performed Panubad, a ritual of offering to ancestral spirits. They called it useless land, she said, but that's where we talked to our ancestors. Now the trees are gone. How do we talk to them? In Samboanga Sibige, Datu Wilfredo L. Sangayan, a Subanen leader, speaks of the frustration with the government's selective listening. They come with cameras, ask us to dance, eat our food, then leave, he said. But when we ask for clean water or protection for our forests, they say there's no budget. His words reflect a wider sentiment. That IP representation has often been reduced to ceremonial tokenism, while the real levers of power remain untouched. Leaders like him remind us that participation without empowerment is just performance. In Maguindanao, Teduray elders tell stories of how FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent was manipulated. A road project was pushed through their domain, splitting sacred hills and bringing logging trucks into their forest. They had said no, but someone signed for them. We were not asked. One elder said, "We were tricked." These testimonies show that legal mechanisms alone are not enough. What's needed is accountability, systems that honor tribal decisions, protect whistleblowers, and punish bad actors who exploit indigenous vulnerabilities. Amid the grief and loss that many tribal leaders carry, there's also a powerful current of hope and continuity. Elders across Mindanao are not just holding the past, they are planting the future. They are mentoring the next generation, passing down rituals, ethics, and political wisdom to ensure that the flame of identity does not die. Many young leaders today were shaped not by textbooks, but by nights around a fire, listening to dadists chant genealogy, or by hours in the forest, learning to read the signs of the earth. In a world that often tries to assimilate or erase them, these young leaders are asserting a different path, one that honors tradition while navigating modernity. For example, in the highlands of Bukidnon, youth councils have emerged under the guidance of tribal elders. These councils blend modern advocacy with cultural preservation, organizing environmental campaigns while also documenting oral traditions. In Teduray territories, young people are learning to write epics in their own script, preserving both the language and the worldview. Some have gone on to become lawyers, teachers, and community organizers, but they carry their roots proudly. One young Subanen leader said, "We are not just leaders because of degrees. We are leaders because our elders trained us." This intergenerational model offers a template for sustainable leadership. It recognizes that elders bring memory and moral authority, while the youth bring energy, new skills, and digital tools. Together, they create a powerful synergy, a bridge between forest law and national policy, between ritual chants and legal arguments. But this synergy must be supported. The government, NGOs, and educational institutions must create platforms for intergenerational dialogue, mentorship, and joint decision-making. Without it, tribal leadership risks becoming fragmented, with the youth either disconnected or co-opted. At the heart of this transition is a simple truth. The future of indigenous peoples cannot be built without their elders. And the wisdom of those who walked before must guide those who now step forward. In the words of one Manobo elder, "We are not fighting to go back to the past. We are fighting to bring the past with us into the future." These voices are not echoes. They are calls to action, and the world must answer. Amid decades of dispossession, cultural erosion, and state neglect, there have been powerful stories of indigenous resilience. Stories where communities, through sheer determination, secured their rights and reclaimed their place in the nation's narrative. One of the most significant victories for many tribes has been the successful acquisition of certificates of ancestral domain title, CADTs. While the process is slow, complex, and often politically contested, some communities have managed to push through the bureaucratic maze and secure legal recognition of their ancestral territories. A remarkable example is the Subanen tribe of Bayog, Samboanga del Sur. For years, they fought to reclaim control over their upland domains, which had long been encroached upon by logging concessions and illegal miners. With the guidance of elders, community mapping initiatives, and partnerships with non-government organizations, they meticulously gathered the oral histories, boundary markers, and genealogies needed for their CADT application. After nearly a decade of sustained effort, including participation in consultations, filing of documentation, and follow-ups with the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples, NCP, their ancestral domain was finally recognized. This victory was not just legal, it was symbolic. It meant the recognition of their identity, their governance, and their right to defend their land from unwanted exploitation. Similarly, in North Cotabato, a Manobo community succeeded in obtaining their CADT despite resistance from local elites and opposition from a large agribusiness firm. Their strategy included leveraging IPRA's legal framework, building alliances with human rights lawyers, and initiating community education to ensure that everyone, from children to elders, understood the significance of their claim. When the title was granted, it became a source of renewed pride and empowerment. These stories prove that the law can work when communities are organized, when allies are committed, and when state actors do their duty. But they also remind us that recognition is only the beginning. After the title comes the challenge of protecting it, managing it sustainably, and ensuring that future generations understand the weight of what has been won. Still, these victories shine as beacons for other communities still waiting for justice, showing that despite the odds, ancestral lands can be reclaimed. While mainstream education systems have failed many indigenous learners, some communities have taken matters into their own hands, building alternative education models rooted in culture, language, and land. These initiatives often emerge through partnerships between elders, youth, and NGOs, and are guided by the understanding that education should not erase identity. It should strengthen it. In doing so, these communities are proving that cultural survival and academic learning can go hand in hand. One inspiring model comes from the Talendig tribe of Bukidnon who established a cultural school that teaches not only reading, writing, and arithmetic, but also music, traditional painting, herbal medicine, peace building, and indigenous philosophy. The school is built within the community and is deeply integrated into daily life. Elders are not just guests, they're full-time mentors. Lessons begin with rituals of gratitude to the ancestors and often incorporate field-based learning, like identifying native plants or interpreting the sounds of birds and rivers. Language instruction happens in Bukid, the native tongue, and only later are Filipino and English introduced. This immersion approach has helped reconnect children with their roots, while still preparing them for broader academic success. In the Teduray communities of Mindanao, similar efforts have emerged, often with the support of the Department of Education's Indigenous Peoples Education (IPED) program. Though funding is limited, these community schools serve as sanctuaries for language preservation and cultural transmission. Students learn to recite chants, tell epic stories, perform traditional dances, and respect sacred geography. One elder, acting as a teacher, said, "We are not teaching them to live in the past. We are teaching them to remember who they are while moving forward." These models are not without challenges. Teachers often work without salaries, schools lack supplies, and state recognition is inconsistent. Yet they continue because the stakes are too high. Without these schools, many languages would vanish and cultural systems would be forgotten within a generation. Community-led education shows what is possible when indigenous agency is respected. It is a testament to the power of learning not just about indigenous peoples, but with and through them. In an era marked by climate crisis and ecological collapse, indigenous communities are increasingly recognized as guardians of biodiversity. Their traditional knowledge, land stewardship practices, and spiritual respect for nature have preserved ecosystems that science is only beginning to understand. In Mindanao, some tribes have turned this wisdom into strategic environmental action, reclaiming their role not just as cultural minorities, but as ecological leaders. In the forest corridors of Higaonon, a coalition of Higaonon elders and youth established a community-based forest monitoring system. With no external funding, they organized patrols to prevent illegal logging, planted native trees, and revived sacred rituals tied to river protection. Their efforts eventually caught the attention of environmental NGOs, which helped them secure support for sustainable agriculture, wildlife documentation, and ecotourism. The community declared their territory a tribal conservation area, not for profit, but for heritage. One elder said, "We do not protect the forest for tourists. We protect it because it is our church, our library, and our memory." The Teduray people of Lake Cebu offer another model of environmental and cultural resilience. Long known for their intricate Tenalic weaving, their traditions are deeply connected to the rhythms of nature. The Tenalic cloth is made from abaca, dyed using indigenous techniques, and woven in patterns revealed through dreams, thus blending ecology, spirituality, and artistry. In recent years, Teduray women weavers have organized cooperatives to pass down their craft, ensure fair income, and educate outsiders about its sacred origins. Their work has not only revived an endangered cultural form, but also empowered women as cultural leaders. These examples highlight how culture and conservation are not separate struggles. They are intertwined. When indigenous peoples are empowered to lead, they create models of sustainability that respect both earth and community. These victories, though often small in scale, are profound in meaning. They challenge mainstream assumptions about development and offer an alternative vision, one where progress is measured not by extraction, but by preservation. They remind us that the most powerful defense of nature often comes not from technology, but from tradition. Despite the passage of the Indigenous Peoples Rights Act, IPRA, in 1997, a law once hailed as a milestone for social justice, many of its provisions remain unimplemented or selectively enforced. Nearly 3 decades later, Indigenous communities across Mindanao still face systematic neglect by the very state that once promised to uphold their rights. In theory, Indigenous peoples have legal recognition, territorial titles, political representation, and cultural protections. In reality, they continue to live in poverty, insecurity, and exclusion, often on the margins of development and public policy. The most visible form of neglect is infrastructural. In dozens of barangays dominated by Subanen, Teduray, Manobo, Higaonon, and Bland populations, roads remain unpaved, bridges unfinished, health clinics non-existent, and schools under-equipped. Many communities still rely on kerosene lamps, collect water from rivers, and walk hours to the nearest medical assistance. National agencies often prioritize urban centers and commercial hubs, bypassing upland and forest areas where most indigenous people live. The excuse given is usually distance or low population density. But what lies beneath is a deeper issue: budgeting systems that reward political visibility over moral urgency. Social services are equally inadequate. Indigenous children have higher dropout rates. Indigenous mothers face greater risks in childbirth, and communities are more vulnerable to disease outbreaks due to lack of access to clean water and basic health care. Programs under the Department of Health, DSWD, and DepEd are often urban-centric, failing to tailor services to tribal realities. Even the NCIP, tasked with protecting indigenous rights, suffers from underfunding, internal inefficiencies, and allegations of favoritism and corruption. In some provinces, it has become more of a bureaucratic bottleneck than a champion of IP interests. This systemic failure is not just a governance issue. It is a violation of dignity and human rights. When elders die without passing on their rituals, when lands are taken because surveys were never conducted, when youth grow up ashamed of their heritage, it is not because the law is weak. It is because the law is forgotten, ignored in practice, and rendered toothless by apathy. The neglect is structural, and until it is addressed as such, the vision of IPRA will remain a paper victory, far from the lived reality of the people it was meant to serve in the face of continued neglect and erosion. Indigenous communities have not remained passive. Resistance is alive and evolving, taking new forms as communities adapt to the changing political and social landscape. From nonviolent mobilizations and legal battles to creative campaigns and intergenerational organizing, Indigenous peoples are asserting their agency in powerful ways. They are not merely victims of a broken system. They're protagonists rewriting their own narratives. One of the most visible forms of resistance is legal advocacy. Armed with the provisions of IPRA, communities are increasingly filing formal petitions against illegal encroachments, questionable development projects, and violations of free, prior, and informed consent FPIC. In Bukidnon, a Manobo community blocked the entry of a multinational mining company, citing incomplete FPIC documentation. With the help of pro bono lawyers and indigenous paralegals trained by NGOs, they brought the issue to the NCIP and the courts, delaying the project and asserting their ancestral claim. These actions, though technical in nature, are deeply rooted in a desire to protect both land and legacy. Resistance has also taken cultural forms. Festivals, rituals, and storytelling gatherings have been revived not merely as celebrations, but as political acts, statements of survival and identity. In Sambuanga del Sur, Subanen youth have organized community radio broadcasts that include traditional music, interviews with elders, and discussions on land rights. In Lake Cebu, Taboli weavers have refused to sell to designers who appropriate their patterns without consent, reclaiming control over cultural production. These acts of defiance may not always make national headlines, but they resonate deeply in the communities where they occur. What makes modern resistance even more dynamic is the intersection of tradition and technology. Indigenous youth now use social media to raise awareness, expose violations, and connect with allies across the country and abroad. Hashtags, viral videos, and online petitions have amplified voices that were once confined to mountain ranges and riversides. This digital activism complements the quiet courage of elders who continue to lead rituals, guard sacred forests, and remind their people of who they are. Resistance today is both ancestral and innovative, rooted in spiritual duty and sharpened by the tools of the 21st century. While grassroots resistance has grown, one of the most persistent battles Indigenous peoples face is the struggle for accountability within institutions that are supposed to protect them. Agencies like the NCIP, local government units, and even some civil society organizations have come under scrutiny for failing to deliver on their mandates. Whether due to political compromise, corruption, lack of will, or simply inefficiency, many policies meant to uplift IP communities end up stalled, misused, or diluted beyond recognition. The NCIP, for example, was created as the implementing arm of IPRA, tasked with overseeing the titling of ancestral domains, ensuring FPIC processes are followed, and coordinating with government agencies for service delivery. Yet in many regions, it has become the subject of frustration. There are reports of delayed CADT processing, mishandled consultations, and internal conflicts between tribal representatives and appointed officials. Some communities allege that NCIP officers have colluded with mining companies, fast-tracking FPIC documents without genuine participation. In other areas, the Commission is simply absent, lacking personnel or budget to respond to urgent needs. This vacuum of leadership has led some IP leaders to call for a full review or overhaul of the agency, demanding transparency and direct accountability to Indigenous communities. At the same time, local government units, LGUs, often treat IP representation as symbolic rather than substantive. IPMRs are sometimes denied resources, excluded from council sessions, or pressured to support the dominant political agenda. Development plans rarely include meaningful IP participation. Even when ordinances are passed to protect ancestral lands or promote culture, implementation is half-hearted or completely forgotten. The problem is not just ignorance. It is a lack of mechanisms to enforce compliance. Without watchdog systems, IP rights are too easily sacrificed for votes, profits, or convenience. But advocacy is pushing back. Indigenous federations are now building coalitions, not just among tribes, but with academics, lawyers, journalists, and environmental groups to demand accountability. They are tracking broken promises, calling out abuses, and proposing reforms, from clearer FPIC protocols to stronger penalties for violators to mandatory cultural competency training for government staff. Some leaders are also advocating for constitutional amendments or an Indigenous peoples autonomy law modeled after frameworks in countries like Bolivia and Canada. The goal is not just to be protected, it is to be self-determining, with political structures that reflect Indigenous values and priorities. This chapter of struggle is far from over, but the momentum is growing. As one Subanen leader said, they want us to be quiet, but we've learned to speak the language of law, of protest, and of dignity. And we're not going back to silence. The Indigenous Peoples of Mindanao stand today at a historic crossroads, caught between the resilience of ancestral memory and the encroaching pressures of modernity. For centuries, their identities were forged in forests, rivers, and mountains, guided by oral traditions and sacred cosmologies. These traditions taught balance, humility, and stewardship. Yet as global capitalism intensifies and climate disruptions grow more severe, the environments that shape these identities are vanishing. Forests once considered eternal are being felled in decades. Rivers that sang through generations are now choked with silt and chemicals. Sacred grounds are paved over for roads, real estate, or resource extraction. In the face of this loss, the question becomes urgent. What kind of future awaits the first peoples of Mindanao? The answer, perhaps, lies in the ability of indigenous communities to adapt without surrendering their identity. History shows they have done this before, during the Spanish conquest, American colonization, post-war migration, and even during martial law. What sets this era apart is the scale and speed of transformation. Digital technology, neoliberal development, and state-led assimilation all press for rapid change. Yet many indigenous communities are responding not with retreat, but with reinvention, reframing tradition in ways that remain rooted yet responsive. For instance, elders now speak through radio stations or Facebook Live. Cultural schools integrate indigenous knowledge with scientific learning. Youth activists blend protest with poetry, rituals with policy proposals. This fusion is not a betrayal of culture, it is a renewal. It shows that being indigenous is not about freezing identity in the past, but about carrying forward values, worldviews, and dignity into the future. It is a reminder that traditional doesn't mean primitive and modern doesn't have to mean destructive. The future is not binary. It can be ancestral and forward-looking, rooted and adaptive, local and global. But this vision requires more than just cultural resilience. It demands structural change, fair laws, accountable institutions, inclusive development, and sustained support. Without these, even the strongest traditions may not survive. As the world enters an age of climate emergency and deep inequality, the future of indigenous peoples in Mindanao may well become a mirror of the nation's soul, a test of whether the Philippines can move forward without leaving its oldest cultures behind. As the struggle for indigenous survival continues, many leaders, scholars, and advocates have begun to outline concrete pathways for meaningful change. These aren't abstract ideals. They are actionable frameworks rooted in years of grassroots experience. If the Philippines truly wishes to uphold the vision of IPRA and the constitutional promise of cultural integrity, it must commit to institutional reforms and deep engagement with indigenous communities. First, there must be a radical improvement in ancestral domain recognition. The issuance of CADTs must be prioritized, fully funded, and depoliticized. Surveys, mapping, and documentation processes should be streamlined and made culturally accessible. The NCP must be restructured to include greater community oversight, transparency mechanisms, and performance accountability. Officers should be vetted not only by credentials, but also by their cultural competence and track record with IP communities. Second, the IPMR system must be strengthened. Guidelines for selection need to be standardized, transparent, and insulated from political interference. Once seated, IPMRs must be given full access to resources, staff support, and voting rights within local councils. Their roles should not be treated as symbolic, but as crucial elements of participatory governance. Capacity building programs must be expanded. not only for IPMRs, but also for LGU officials to better understand Indigenous law and leadership systems. Third, education must be indigenized and localized. This goes beyond the IP-Ed program. It means recruiting and training Indigenous teachers, producing culturally relevant curricula, and expanding tribal schools that integrate language, land, and identity. Schools must become spaces of empowerment, not assimilation. Likewise, health systems should employ Indigenous healers as partners, not as curiosities, and design culturally respectful delivery models. Finally, media, policy, and development discourse must change. Indigenous peoples must not be portrayed as relics or victims, but as knowledge holders and rights bearers. Their stories must be written in textbooks, their leaders invited into policymaking, and their consent respected at every level. Development projects, whether in energy, agriculture, or infrastructure, must begin with the principle of Indigenous self-determination, not top-down planning. True progress will not come from charity, pity, or short-term programs. It will come from partnership based on justice. A future where the state does not merely allow IPs to survive, but enables them to thrive, lead, and shape the national direction. Recognition is not the end goal. Respect is. And respect, in this context, means land, voice, and future, secured not through promise, but through action. In the end, the future of Indigenous peoples in Mindanao is not just their responsibility. It is a national moral imperative. How a nation treats its first peoples says everything about its values, its memory, and its capacity for justice. No democracy can claim to be inclusive while its original stewards remain dispossessed. No development can claim to be sustainable while its beneficiaries trample on ancestral wisdom. And no identity can be fully Filipino if it does not make space for Subanen, Teduray, Manobo, Boli, Higaonon, Bland, and all other IP voices. What is needed now is deep listening. Listening that is not performative, but transformative. Listening that hears not only the words of tribal leaders, but the silence of disappearing rituals, the weeping of desecrated forests, the memory in old songs. It also requires humility. The humility to admit that systems have failed, that the nation's history is scarred with dispossession, and that redress requires more than apologies. But listening is not enough. The future requires allyship from government workers, teachers, journalists, clergy, youth, and fellow citizens. To stand with Indigenous peoples is not to speak for them, but to make space for them to speak, act, and lead. It is to challenge extractive development models, to support cultural revival, and to vote for policies that protect tribal lands and languages. It is to educate oneself, dismantle stereotypes, and amplify authentic IP voices. It is to stand behind, not in front. Indigenous peoples do not need saving. They need solidarity and sovereignty. They are not backward. They are bearers of insight that this fast-moving world desperately needs. How to live with the earth. How to value community over consumption. How to find meaning in connection rather than domination. The future of the Philippines, socially, environmentally, and spiritually, may depend on whether it embraces or abandons its indigenous roots. For in their survival lies a deeper form of national survival. In their songs, the nation may rediscover its soul. And in walking with them, not ahead of them, the country may yet find a path that is not just modern, but truly just inclusive and whole. Thank you for staying with us through this powerful and essential journey into the heart of Mindanao's indigenous history. Today, we listen to the stories of lands taken, voices silenced, rituals erased, and a people left behind by the very laws meant to protect them. But we also witness stories of resistance and renewal, tribes who fought back with tradition, who revived their languages, who led with dignity, and who proved that culture is not a thing of the past, but a force of the future. What is the moral of this story? That rights on paper mean nothing without justice in practice. That land is more than soil. It is memory, spirit, and survival. That indigenous peoples are not relics of a forgotten age. They're torchbearers of wisdom we desperately need today. As we move forward as a nation, let's ask ourselves, can we truly speak of progress while leaving the first peoples behind? Let this not be the end of the conversation. Let this be a beginning of awareness, of action, and of allyship. If you found this series enlightening, subscribe to History Teller YT and hit the bell icon so you won't miss our next deep dive into the hidden stories that shape our world. Because here at History Teller YT, we don't just tell history. We give it back to the people who lived it